The sterile smell of a hospital at 3 in the morning usually means one of two things: a difficult birth or a lingering death. For Damien Costa, a man who controlled the city's underground shipping routes with a velvet glove and an iron fist, it meant someone was trying to take his entire world. When the panicked call came that his 5-year-old son had collapsed, Damien expected a war. He mobilized his most lethal enforcers, ready to tear the pediatric ward down to its foundations. But when he finally kicked open the door to room 412, expecting to find a cartel hit squad, he found a hospital cleaning lady. Armed with a shattered mop handle, bleeding heavily from her temple, she was standing directly over his sleeping boy. And she absolutely refused to move. Damien Costa did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for men who did not have targets on their backs, men who didn't manage a billion-dollar syndicate that stretched from the ports of New Jersey to the high-rises of Manhattan. At 34, Damien was a widow, a ruthless strategist, and a father. He had spent the last 3 years systematically cleansing his organization of the old volatile guard, shifting his family's wealth into legitimate real estate and international shipping. But peace always comes at a bloody price, and the wolves were always circling. It was 11:45 p.m. on a rain-slicked Tuesday. Damien was sitting in a dimly lit private dining room at Le Bernardin, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. Across the table sat 2 lieutenants from a rival faction in Brooklyn, men who were currently testing his patience over a disrupted shipment of electronics. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, his private cell phone vibrated. Only 3 people had this number: his underboss, his sister, and Mrs. Higgins, the live-in nanny who cared for his 5-year-old son, Leo. Damien held up a finger, silencing the men across from him, and answered. "Speak, Mr. Costa." Mrs. Higgins' voice was a frantic, breathless sob. "It's Leo. He collapsed. He couldn't breathe. His lips went blue. The ambulance is here. They're taking him to Lenox Hill. They said his heart." The glass of scotch slipped from Damien's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The Brooklyn lieutenants jumped, their hands instinctively reaching inside their jackets. But Damien didn't even look at them. His mind had already left the room. Leo had been born with a mild ventricular septal defect, a small hole in his heart that the doctors had sworn was closing on its own. He was supposed to be fine. He was supposed to be safe. "I am on my way," Damien said, his voice dropping an octave, turning cold and mechanical to mask the sheer terror clawing at his throat. He hung up and stood. "Meeting's over." Without waiting for a response, he strode out of the restaurant. His lead bodyguard, Elias, fell into step beside him instantly, reading the catastrophic shift in his boss's demeanor. "Lenox Hill Hospital," Damien barked as they climbed into the back of an armored Mercedes G-Wagon, waiting at the curb. "Tell the driver to run every red light. And call Luca. I want the entire 4th floor of that hospital locked down. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. If the doctors have a problem with it, buy the hospital." The drive up the FDR Drive was a blur of neon lights and torrential rain. Damien stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. In his world, coincidences did not exist. A sudden catastrophic health failure in his son, the very week he was negotiating a hostile takeover of the Brooklyn docks? It defied logic. Someone had gotten to Leo. Someone had bypassed the state-of-the-art security at his Long Island estate. If they touched him, Damien thought, his hands curling into fists, "I will burn this city to the ground." When the SUV screeched to a halt in the ambulance bay of Lenox Hill, Damien was out of the door before the vehicle had fully stopped. Elias and 3 other heavily armed men flanked him as he bypassed the emergency room triage, ignoring the protests of the night staff. He flashed a black titanium credit card and a look of pure murder at the head nurse. "Leo Costa. Where is he?" "Pediatric intensive care. 4th floor, room 412, the nurse stammered, intimidated by the imposing men in tailored suits. "But sir, visiting hours." Damien was already moving towards the elevators. The ride to the 4th floor felt like an eternity. The elevator hummed, a cheerful, mundane sound that mocked the violent thumping of Damien's heart. He drew his sidearm, a sleek, suppressed Glock 19, and held it down by his side. Elias did the same. If this was a hit, the assassins would be waiting at the choke points. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Damien stepped out, expecting to see his advance team, the men Luca was supposed to have stationed at the perimeter. Instead, the hallway was eerily silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows. At the end of the corridor, near the nurse's station, a security guard lay slumped over the desk. Beside him, one of Damien's own men, a seasoned enforcer named Bruno, was sprawled on the linoleum, a dark pool of crimson expanding from beneath his shoulder. Damien's blood ran cold. He had been right. It wasn't an illness. It was an assassination. "Secure the perimeter," Damien whispered to Elias. "Shoot anyone who isn't wearing scrubs. And if they are wearing scrubs and they run, shoot them in the legs." Damien moved down the hallway with terrifying speed, his eyes locked on the door of room 412. It was closed. The blinds were drawn. He didn't bother checking the handle. He took a step back, raised his right leg, and kicked the heavy wooden door with enough force to shatter the deadbolt. The door flew open, crashing against the interior wall with a deafening bang. Damien leveled his weapon, sweeping the room, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Get away from him!" a woman's voice screamed. Damien froze. The scene before him made absolutely no sense. The room was bathed in the dim, rhythmic blue glow of a telemetry monitor, tracing the steady, albeit weak, heartbeat of 5-year-old Leo. The boy was unconscious, an oxygen mask strapped over his pale face, an IV line snaking into his small arm. But it wasn't the boy that made Damien lower his weapon a fraction of an inch. Standing between the hospital bed and the doorway was a woman. She wasn't a cartel sicario. She wasn't a rival mobster. She was wearing standard-issue, faded blue hospital scrubs, a heavy canvas apron, and thick rubber gloves. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, but several strands were plastered to her forehead by a mixture of sweat and a steady stream of blood leaking from a deep gash above her left eyebrow. In her trembling hands, she held the jagged, splintered end of a heavy wooden mop handle. She had it leveled at Damien's chest like a spear. "I said, stay back!" she yelled, her voice raw and cracking, though she didn't retreat a single inch. Her knuckles were white from gripping the wood. "I pressed the panic button. The police are coming. You touch him, and I swear to God I'll drive this through your neck." Damien stared at her, genuinely stunned. In his 20 years in the underworld, he had faced down hardened killers, corrupt politicians, and sociopathic cartel bosses. But he had never been threatened by a 130-pound cleaning lady wielding a broken Jansan mop. "Who the hell are you?" Damien demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He kept his gun out but angled it toward the floor. "I'm the person who is going to stop you from finishing the job," she spat back, her chest heaving. Blood dripped from her chin onto the linoleum. "Put the gun down!" Elias rushed into the room behind Damien, his weapon raised. "Boss, clear the—" "Stop!" Damien barked, raising a hand to halt his bodyguard. He looked around the room. A heavy medical cart had been pushed against the door as a makeshift barricade, which Damien had violently shoved aside when he kicked the door in. On the floor, near the window, lay a shattered syringe, its clear liquid pooling on the tiles. Beside it was a standard-issue doctor's clipboard, trampled and broken. Damien's sharp eyes pieced the puzzle together in seconds. The spilled liquid, the barricade, the bleeding woman, the dead men in the hall. Someone had already been here, and this woman had fought them off. Slowly, deliberately, Damien engaged the safety of his Glock and slid it back into its shoulder holster. He raised his empty hands, palms facing outward. "I'm not here to hurt him," Damien said. his voice softening, though the intense, predatory edge never left his eyes. "That boy in the bed. He is my son. I am Damien Costa." The woman's eyes widened, darting from Damien to Elias, and then to the little boy in the bed. She scrutinized Damien's face, tracing the shared features, the sharp jawline, the dark, intense eyes that Leo also possessed. The adrenaline that had been holding her together seemed to evaporate all at once. The splintered mop handle drooped, the tip hitting the floor with a hollow clack. "Your son," she breathed out. Her knees buckled. Damien moved faster than he had in years. He closed the distance and caught her by the arms before she could hit the floor, guiding her gently to a small vinyl visitor's chair in the corner of the room. Up close, he could see the extent of her injuries. The cut on her head was deep, likely requiring stitches, and an ugly, dark bruise was already forming on her jaw. "Elias, get a medic in here, now," Damien ordered without looking back. "No," the woman gasped, grabbing Damien's expensive suit jacket with a blood-stained rubber glove. "No doctors, you can't trust them. Not right now." Damien looked down at her. "What is your name?" "Maya," she whispered, wincing as she pressed a sterile gauze pad from her apron pocket against her bleeding head. "Maya Lawson." "Maya," Damien said, kneeling beside her chair so he was at eye level. He ignored the blood transferring onto his bespoke lapel. "Tell me exactly what happened in this room." Maya took a shaky breath, her eyes locked on the steady rise and fall of Leo's chest. "I was on my shift, doing the floor buffers in the hallway. I noticed the security guard at the desk was asleep. I thought he was just slacking off, but then a doctor walked past me. He was wearing a white coat, a surgical mask, and a stethoscope." "A doctor in the pediatric ICU isn't unusual," Damien noted. "At 1 a.m. it is," Maya corrected, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "Dr. Evans is the attending tonight, and he's doing rounds on the 3rd floor. I know the rotation. But this man, he didn't check the chart outside the door. He didn't sanitize his hands at the wall dispenser. He just walked straight in. And his shoes." "His shoes?" They were heavy, leather combat boots. Not clogs, not sneakers. Doctors don't wear boots on a 12-hour shift. They wear hokas or danskos. Damien felt a flicker of profound respect cut through his anxiety. This woman possessed an observational awareness that rivaled his best lookouts. "So you followed him?" Damien prompted. "I looked through the window on the door," Maya continued, shivering slightly. "He was standing over your son. He pulled a syringe from his pocket. It didn't have a pharmacy label. He was going to inject it directly into the IV line. I just reacted. You went in. I hit the door with my mop bucket. I shoved it right into the back of his knees. He stumbled, and I hit the panic alarm on the wall. He turned around and swung at me. He had a heavy flashlight or something in his hand. Hit me in the head." Maya closed her eyes, fighting off a wave of dizziness. "I went down, but I swung the mop handle upward and caught him in the throat. He dropped the syringe. By then the alarm was blaring down the hall. He looked at the boy, looked at me, and bolted out the emergency stairwell door." Damien stared at the shattered syringe on the floor. If that had gone into Leo's bloodstream, potassium chloride, a massive dose of insulin, or an untraceable paralytic, Leo would have suffered a fatal heart attack. The initial collapse at home had just been the setup to get him into a vulnerable, predictable environment like a hospital bed. "He's still in the building," Elias said from the doorway, having listened to the entire exchange. "The local police are pulling up downstairs, responding to the panic alarm. But our guys are sealing the exits." Damien stood up. The fragile peace he had built in the city was dead. Whoever had orchestrated this had crossed the ultimate line. But right now, his only priority was the sleeping boy in the bed, and the fiercely brave woman sitting in the corner. "Maya," Damien said, turning back to the cleaning lady, "why did you do it? You clean floors. You don't get paid to fight off professional hitmen. You could have walked away. You could have let it happen and stayed alive." Maya looked up at him. Beneath the blood and exhaustion, there was a profound, unshakable sorrow in her brown eyes. "Because a hospital is supposed to be a safe place for a child," she said softly. "3 years ago, I sat in a hospital room, just like this one, watching monitors, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening. I lost my daughter. Her name was Lily." She looked over at Leo. "I couldn't save my little girl, but I could save him. So I did." Damien, a man who had long ago buried his empathy beneath layers of survival instinct and brutality, felt something fracture in his chest. The wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing louder as NYPD cruisers converged on Lenox Hill. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the rain-streaked window of room 412, casting a chaotic strobe effect over the sterile white walls. "Boss," Elias warned, stepping into the room and checking his watch. "The cops are in the lobby. Hospital administration is throwing a fit. We can't hold the perimeter much longer without starting a firefight with the NYPD, and we cannot afford that kind of heat tonight." Damien ignored him for a moment, walking over to Leo's bed. He gently placed his large, calloused hand against his son's cheek. The boy's skin was cool, his breathing shallow but steady. The doctors at the ER had pumped him full of steroids and sedatives to stabilize his respiratory distress, completely unaware that the distress had likely been induced by a microscopic dose of a localized toxin, just enough to trigger a 911 call. "We are leaving," Damien declared, pulling his hand away and turning to face Elias. "Call Dr. Aris. No, Dr. Samuel Bennett. Tell him to prep the underground clinic beneath the Brooklyn shipyard. We are moving, Leo." "Move him?" Maya protested, struggling to stand up. "Are you insane? He's sedated. He needs continuous cardiac monitoring. You can't just unhook him and throw him in a car." Damien looked at her, his expression unreadable. "If he stays here, he dies. The man who tried to kill him bypassed my security, killed one of my best men, and walked into this room unquestioned. Whoever orchestrated this has people on the inside. I don't trust the doctors here. I don't trust the police who are walking into the lobby right now. I have a private medical facility that is an absolute fortress. He needs a stabilized transport unit," Maya argued, stepping between Damien and the bed again, though less aggressively this time. "If his oxygen saturation drops during the ride, do you know how to intubate a 5-year-old? Because I highly doubt your heavily armed friends do." Damien narrowed his eyes. "You seem to know an awful lot about medical protocols for a janitor, Miss Lawson." Maya hesitated, looking down at her blood-stained gloves. "I was a pediatric trauma nurse at Johns Hopkins for 6 years, before Lily got sick. Her medical bills destroyed me. I lost my license because I started stealing painkillers from the pharmacy to cope after she died. Cleaning floors was the only union job I could get with a criminal record." The room fell silent, save for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Damien processed this information. It explained her quick thinking, her recognition of the fake doctor's anomalies, and her fierce protectiveness over a sick child. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a disgraced, grieving professional who had just found redemption at the end of a mop handle. "Elias," Damien said sharply, "prep the armored ambulance we keep at the Midtown garage. Get it to the loading dock in 5 minutes." He then turned his full attention to Maya. "You're coming with us." Maya took a step back. "Excuse me." "No. I saved your kid. I did my good deed. I'm going to go talk to the police, give a statement, and go home to my tiny, overpriced apartment." "You can't go to the police," Damien said, stepping closer. The imposing aura of the Mafia boss radiated from him, heavy and suffocating. "The man who was in this room wasn't a street thug. He is a high-tier professional. He saw your face. He knows you intervened. By tomorrow morning, whoever hired him will know exactly who Maya Lawson is. If you stay here, if you go to the police, you will be dead before the weekend." Maya swallowed hard, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. You're in the Mafia. You're Damien Costa, the shipping magnate. I've read about you in the papers." "The papers only print half the truth, and it's the boring half," Damien replied smoothly. "You saved my son's life tonight, Maya. In my world, a debt of that magnitude is sacred. I protect what is mine, and right now you are the only reason my son is breathing. That puts you under my protection." "I don't want your protection." "It wasn't an offer," Damien stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Elias, unhook the monitors. Maya, pack whatever medical supplies you need from this room to keep him stable for a 20-minute drive. We go down the freight elevator to the loading dock." Before Maya could protest further, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. A team of 4 NYPD officers, weapons drawn, burst through the stairwell doors, shouting commands. "NYPD, drop your weapons!" a sergeant roared down the corridor, aiming his flashlight at Elias and the other guards. Damien didn't even flinch. "Elias, handle them. Buy us 3 minutes." Elias smirked, dropping his weapon to the floor and raising his hands, casually walking out of the room to intercept the officers, fully prepared to be arrested to give his boss an opening. Officers, calm down. Let me show you my concealed carry permits." Damien turned to Maya. 3 minutes. Unhook him. Now." Pushed by a chaotic mix of fear, instinct, and the undeniable command in Damien's voice, Maya snapped back into her old persona. The grieving mother and the tired janitor vanished, replaced by the Hopkins trauma nurse. She moved with lightning precision. She silenced the alarms on the telemetry unit, clamped the IV lines, and expertly transferred Leo from the wall oxygen unit to a portable green oxygen tank strapped to the base of the bed. "He's detached. But we can't roll this bed down a freight elevator unseen," Maya said, her heart pounding against her ribs. Damien didn't hesitate. He leaned down and scooped his unconscious son into his arms, cradling him against his chest. Leo looked painfully small against the dark fabric of his father's ruined designer suit. "Grab the portable monitor and the oxygen," Damien instructed. "Follow me. Keep your head down." They slipped out of the room just as Elias was loudly arguing with the police sergeant near the nurses' station, drawing their complete attention. Damien moved like a ghost, navigating the back corridors of the hospital with the layout memorized, a precaution he took in every building he ever entered. They reached the heavy metal doors of the freight elevator. Damien pressed the call button with a bloody knuckle. "You're making a mistake," Maya whispered fiercely as they waited for the elevator to rise. "You're kidnapping him from a hospital." "I'm saving his life," Damien corrected, looking down at his son. "And I'm saving yours, whether you like it or not." The elevator doors groaned open. Standing inside, holding a suppressed submachine gun, was a man in a janitor's uniform. But the uniform was pristine, and his eyes were cold and dead. He raised the weapon, aiming directly at Damien's chest. "Well," the hitman smiled, "this saves me a trip upstairs." Time, for a man accustomed to violence, does not slow down during a gunfight. It shatters into razor-sharp fragments of instinct. Damien held his 5-year-old son against his chest, completely restricting his right hand. The hitman in the elevator smiled, his finger tightening on the trigger of the suppressed MAC-10. Damien had a fraction of a second to turn his body, preparing to take the volley of 9mm rounds into his own back to shield Leo. But Maya Lawson did not freeze. In her hands, she held the heavy, solid steel D-cylinder oxygen tank that she had unhooked from the wall just moments ago. With a guttural cry that echoed off the linoleum walls, Maya swung the heavy green cylinder in a brutal arc. The solid steel connected with the hitman's extended wrist with a sickening crack. The man howled, the MAC-10 discharging a wild, suppressed burst into the ceiling panels, raining acoustic tile and plaster down on them. Before the assassin could recover his grip with his left hand, Damien lunged forward. Using his free left arm, Damien seized the front of the man's pristine janitorial shirt, hauled him out of the elevator cab, and drove his knee upward into the man's sternum with piston-like force. The hitman collapsed, gasping for air, the weapon clattering across the hallway floor. "Get in!" Damien roared, stepping over the groaning man and shoving Maya into the freight elevator. He slammed the button for the sub-basement loading dock, his chest heaving as the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing them in a sudden, jarring silence. Maya dropped the oxygen tank, her knees finally giving out. She slid down the metal wall of the elevator, trembling violently, her bloody hands covering her face. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline crash hitting her system like a freight train. Damien stood perfectly still, balancing his unconscious son against his hip. He looked down at the former pediatric nurse turned cleaning lady. She had just assaulted an armed professional killer without a second of hesitation. "Breathe, Maya," Damien commanded, his voice surprisingly gentle, cutting through her rising panic. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. You are safe. I have you." "I hit him," she gasped, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at her hands. "I broke his wrist. I heard the bone snap. You saved my life, and you saved Leo's." "Again," Damien said, kneeling carefully beside her as the elevator descended. "Do not apologize for surviving. In my world, hesitation is death. You didn't hesitate." The elevator jolted to a halt at the sub-basement level. The doors opened to the harsh, fluorescent glare of the hospital's loading dock. A matte black Mercedes-Benz Sprinter van, heavily modified with reinforced suspension and bullet-resistant glass, sat idling between two garbage compactors. A massive, broad-shouldered man in a tailored tactical jacket stepped out of the driver's side, a Sig Sauer MPX rifle slung across his chest. This was Declan, one of Damien's most trusted drivers and a former ranger. "Boss," Declan said, his eyes scanning the empty loading bay before landing on Damien, the boy, and the terrified woman in scrubs. Elias radioed. "The NYPD is locking down the front lobby. We need to move. Now." "Open the back," Damien ordered. Declan threw open the rear doors of the Sprinter. Inside, it wasn't a standard cargo van. It was a fully equipped mobile trauma unit. Stainless steel counters, secure stretcher locks, overhead surgical lights, and a wall of emergency medical supplies lined the interior. Damien laid Leo gently onto the primary stretcher, securing the harness across the boy's small chest. "Get in, Maya," Damien said, offering his hand. Maya looked at the imposing vehicle, the heavily armed driver, and the dark, rainy night outside the loading bay. Her old life, her tiny apartment in Queens, her union job, her quiet, crushing grief, was gone. Shattered the moment she picked up that mop handle. She took Damien's hand. His grip was warm, rough, and anchoring. He pulled her into the back of the van and slammed the doors shut. The Sprinter surged forward, tearing out of the Lenox Hill loading dock and merging recklessly onto the rain-slicked pavement of the FDR Drive. "Declan, get us to the Brooklyn Navy Yard," Damien ordered through the intercom partition. "Take the Manhattan Bridge. If anyone tails us, lose them or put them in the river." "Copy that, boss." In the back of the swaying van, Maya immediately fell back into her training. The clinical environment of the mobile unit seemed to center her. She found a pair of trauma shears, cut away Leo's ruined hospital gown, and began attaching the van's integrated telemetry leads to his pale chest. Damien watched her work in silence. The stark lighting caught the deep gash on her forehead, still slowly weeping blood, and the dark bruising along her jaw. Yet her hands were completely steady as she calibrated the portable oxygen concentrator and checked Leo's pupillary response with a penlight. "His heart rate is bradycardic. Too slow," Maya muttered, more to herself than to Damien. She opened a secure cabinet, scanning the vials of medication. The ER doctors gave him a standard corticosteroid for the respiratory distress, but if the assassin at your house slipped him something before the collapse, the steroids might be masking the true toxidrome. Damien's eyes narrowed. "You think my son was poisoned before he even reached the hospital?" Maya looked up, her brown eyes meeting his intense gaze. "You said someone bypassed your home security. A boy with a minor ventricular septal defect doesn't just suddenly turn blue in the middle of the night without a trigger. If the hitman in the hospital was trying to inject him, it was likely to finish a job that started at your estate." Damien felt a cold fury settle deep in his bones. The Long Island estate was a fortress. Only his inner circle had access to the kitchen, the private quarters, and the nursery. "If you're right," Damien said softly, a promise of extreme violence woven into his words, "there won't be a hole deep enough for them to hide in." The Sprinter van bypassed the main entrances of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, navigating a labyrinth of abandoned dry docks and rusted shipping containers. Declan steered the heavy vehicle into a massive, nondescript warehouse, flanked by towering cranes. The heavy steel roll-up doors closed behind them, plunging them into darkness for a brief second before high-powered halogen lights flooded the interior. Damien carried Leo out of the van, striding toward a reinforced steel door at the back of the warehouse. Maya followed closely, clutching the portable medical kit. A biometric scanner flashed green as Damien pressed his palm against it, and the heavy door hissed open, revealing a pristine, blindingly white corridor. At the end of the hall stood Dr. Samuel Bennett. He was a brilliant, disgraced former chief of surgery at Mount Sinai, whose gambling debts had made him desperate enough to accept Damien Costa's highly lucrative, off-the-books employment. "Damien," Dr. Bennett said, motioning them into a fully functional intensive care suite. "Put him on the table. What are his vitals? Heart rate is 45. Oxygen saturation is hovering at 89% on 4 liters of supplemental O2. Maya rattled off instantly, stepping around the doctor to plug Leo's leads into the room's main monitors. "He's unresponsive to sternal rubs. I suspect a localized paralytic, mixed with a slow-acting beta blocker, ingested roughly 4 hours ago." Dr. Bennett blinked, taken aback by the bloodied woman in scrubs taking command of his trauma bay. He looked at Damien. "Who is she?" "She is the reason my son is alive. Listen to her," Damien stated flatly, stripping off his ruined suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair. The holstered Glock 19 was now clearly visible against his white dress shirt, a stark reminder of the danger they were in. For the next hour, Damien stood in the corner of the room, an immovable shadow, watching Maya and Dr. Bennett work. They drew blood, ran rapid toxicology screens using a massive centrifuge in the corner, and administered a cocktail of counteragents. Slowly, agonizingly, the blue tint faded from Leo's lips. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor sped up, settling into a steady, reassuring rhythm. "She was right," Dr. Bennett finally said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he held up a printout from the tox screen. "It's an obscure, synthesized beta blocker, odorless, tasteless, usually dissolved in water or milk. It forces the heart rate to plummet, mimicking a severe cardiac event. If he hadn't gotten to the ER when he did, his heart would have stopped entirely." Damien stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. "Milk. Mrs. Higgins gives him a glass of warm milk every night at 8 o'clock. I can flush the rest of it out of his system with aggressive IV fluids and a glucagon drip," Dr. Bennett assured him. "He's going to be weak, and he will sleep for the next 24 hours. But there shouldn't be any permanent neurological or cardiac damage." Damien exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. He walked to the side of the bed and gently brushed his son's dark hair back from his forehead. "Thank you, Samuel." "Don't thank me," Dr. Bennett said, packing up his instruments. "Thank your new trauma nurse. I'll be in the adjacent lab analyzing the blood samples to see if I can trace the origin of the toxin. Call me if his pressure drops." The heavy glass door slid shut, leaving Damien and Maya alone in the quiet hum of the ICU suite. Maya stood on the opposite side of the bed, her hands resting lightly on the metal rail. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving her looking fragile, exhausted, and bruised. Damien walked over to a stainless steel medical cabinet. He pulled out a sterile suture kit, a bottle of antiseptic, and several gauze pads. He walked back to Maya and set the supplies on a small rolling tray next to her. "Sit down," Damien instructed. Maya blinked, confused. "I need to monitor his fluid intake. Leo is stable. You are bleeding on my floor," Damien said softly, pulling a rolling stool up to her. "Sit, Maya." Too tired to argue, she sank onto the stool. Damien stepped into her personal space. He stood between her knees, tearing open a sterile alcohol wipe. He reached out, his large, rough fingers gently tilting her chin upward. Maya flinched at the sudden contact. "I won't hurt you," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze was different now. The predator was gone, replaced by something deeply protective and undeniably intimate. "This is going to sting." He pressed the antiseptic wipe to the deep gash above her eyebrow. Maya hissed, her hands gripping the edge of the stool. Damien worked with surprising precision, cleaning the dried blood from her forehead and cheek. As he leaned in, Maya could smell the rain, the expensive sandalwood cologne, and the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder on him. "Why do you live like this?" Maya asked quietly, the exhaustion stripping away her filters. "Guns in hospitals, hitmen in elevators, your own son poisoned in his bed. Is the money worth this kind of terror?" Damien paused, the sterile pad hovering near her temple. His jaw tightened. "I didn't choose this life for the money, Maya," he answered, his voice a low gravel. "I inherited a war. My father built an empire on blood and fear. When he died, the vultures tried to tear it apart. I took control to dismantle the illicit operations, to legitimize the Costa name, so Leo would never have to hold a gun. But peace is a threat to men who profit from chaos. I am trying to build a safe world for him, but I have to burn the old one down first." He picked up a butterfly bandage, expertly sealing the wound on her forehead. "Whoever poisoned him," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "They had to be close to you, to get to his milk." "Yes," Damien agreed, his eyes darkening. "It was an inside job, and whoever orchestrated it knows that the hit at the hospital failed. They know you intervened. They know I have Leo." He finished taping a small gauze pad over the stitches, letting his hand linger for a second against her jaw, his thumb brushing the edge of the dark bruise the hitman had left. Maya's breath hitched. The air in the sterile room suddenly felt very thick, charged with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the gunfire they had just escaped. "You can't go back to your apartment," Damien said, stepping back slightly, though his eyes never left hers. "You can't go back to the hospital. You are a loose end to them now, and I do not leave loose ends unprotected." "I am not one of your assets, Damien," she protested, though there was no real heat in her voice. "No," he agreed softly. "You are the woman who fought a killer with a mop handle to save my son. You are staying with us. Here, in the bunker, until I find out who ordered this hit. And once I do, I will eliminate them. Until then, you are under my protection." Before Maya could respond, the heavy steel door to the ICU suite buzzed and slid open. Luca, Damien's underboss and oldest friend, walked in. His expensive trench coat was soaked with rain, and his face was grim. "Boss," Luca said, glancing cautiously at Maya before looking back at Damien. "We have a problem. A massive one." "Speak," Damien ordered, the tenderness vanishing, instantly replaced by the ruthless syndicate leader. "The hitman Elias, detained at the hospital, bit a cyanide capsule in the back of the NYPD cruiser before he could be booked," Luca reported grimly. "But we ran facial recognition on the guy you left in the loading dock elevator." "And?" "He's not Brooklyn Syndicate. He's not cartel." Luca took a deep breath. "He's one of O'Rourke's top fixers, the Irish mob out of Hell's Kitchen. They've been our allies for a decade, but that's not the worst part." Damien's hands curled into fists. "What is it, Luca?" "We pulled the security feeds from the Long Island estate from earlier tonight. The tapes were scrubbed, but our tech team recovered a fragment of the firewall logs, the access codes used to bypass the kitchen security and poison Leo's milk. They belong to your sister." Damien froze. The silence in the room was deafening. The name hung in the sterile, heavily filtered air of the ICU suite like a live grenade. Damien's dark eyes shifted from Luca's grim face to the floor, processing the absolute impossibility of the statement. "Victoria," Damien whispered, the syllables tasting like ash in his mouth. His older sister, the woman who had practically raised him after their mother died, the woman who doted on Leo with an obsessive, fiercely protective love. "The firewall logs are definitive, Damien," Luca said, his voice laced with heavy, calculated sympathy. He stepped closer, running a hand through his damp, graying hair. "The security bypass on the kitchen cameras at 7:30 p.m., right before Mrs. Higgins prepared the milk. It was authorized using Victoria's master biometric override. And O'Rourke's men? They've been seen near her Greenwich Village brownstone all week. She's been leveraged, boss. Or worse, she made a deal." "Victoria does not make deals with the Irish," Damien growled, the predatory edge returning to his voice. "She despises Liam O'Rourke, and she would sooner tear out her own heart than hurt Leo." "People change when they are backed into a corner," Luca argued softly. "The syndicate's transition into legitimate shipping has cut into the old family profits. Victoria's offshore accounts have been bleeding dry. O'Rourke wants the Brooklyn docks. Maybe he offered her a percentage to step out of the way and remove the only heir." Maya stood silently near the heart monitor, her hands trembling slightly. She watched the two men, feeling entirely out of her depth, but acutely aware of the shifting, dangerous dynamics in the room. Her eyes darted to Luca. There was something in his posture, a stiffness in his shoulders, a deliberate pacing, that made her clinical instincts flare. As a trauma nurse, she was trained to read micro-expressions, to anticipate panic or aggression in volatile patients. Luca didn't look like a man delivering heartbreaking news to his oldest friend. He looked like a man reciting a rehearsed script. "I need to see her," Damien declared, grabbing a fresh suit jacket from a nearby chair and checking the magazine of his Glock 19. "If O'Rourke has his claws in my sister, I will sever his hands. If she betrayed me, I will handle it." "I'll come with you," Luca offered immediately, reaching inside his tailored coat. "No," Damien commanded. "You stay here. Lock down the shipyard. Nobody gets in or out of this bunker. Elias and Declan will come with me to the village. You protect my son, Luca. And you protect Maya." Maya felt a cold spike of dread nail her feet to the floor. "Damien, wait!" Damien paused at the reinforced steel door, turning back to her. The hardened Mafia boss softened for a fraction of a second. "I will be back, Maya. I swear it on my life. Keep him breathing." Before she could voice the irrational, gnawing panic in her chest, the heavy steel door slid shut, the biometric lock engaging with a heavy thud. Maya was left in the underground bunker with Dr. Bennett, the sleeping boy, and Luca. For the first 20 minutes, the bunker was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, reassuring beep of Leo's telemetry monitor. Doctor Bennett retreated to his adjacent lab to analyze the blood samples, leaving Maya and Luca alone in the main trauma bay. Luca stood by the door, his arms crossed, staring blankly at the wall. Maya busied herself by checking Leo's IV line and adjusting the flow rate of the glucagon drip, but her peripheral vision remained locked on Damien's underboss. "You're very good at your job, Miss Lawson," Luca said suddenly, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. "I'm just following standard pediatric toxicology protocols," Maya replied evenly, keeping her back to him as she charted Leo's vitals on a clipboard. "It's a shame, really," Luca mused, taking a slow step away from the door and moving toward the center of the room. Damien is a brilliant tactician, but his fatal flaw has always been his sentimentality. He brings a civilian, a hospital janitor no less, into a secure facility because she showed a little bravery. He leaves his most valuable asset unguarded because he's chasing a ghost. Maya froze, her pen hovering over the paper. The air in the room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. She slowly turned around. Luca had a suppressed Heckler and Coke USP tactical pistol drawn, the matte black barrel aimed directly at her chest. Victoria didn't betray him, Maya stated, her voice remarkably steady, despite the violent hammering of her heart against her ribs. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in her mind. Of course she didn't, Luca smiled, a cold, empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. Victoria is currently tied to a chair in her basement, guarded by 3 of Liam O'Rourke's finest butchers. Damien is walking into a meat grinder. The biometric logs were easy to spoof if you have top-tier administrative access, which I do. "You poisoned the boy," Maya said, taking a calculated step backward, positioning her body between the gun and Leo's bed. "I facilitated it," Luca corrected. "I spent 30 years building this syndicate with Damien's father. Then Damien takes over and decides we are going to be legitimate businessmen? Shipping manifests and real estate taxes? There is a billion-dollar underworld begging to be ruled, and he wanted to play CEO. O'Rourke offered me a 50-50 split of the eastern seaboard if I handed him the Costa Empire without a war. A bloodless coup. But for that to happen, the king and the prince had to die tonight. And a hitman at the hospital? A contingency, Luca shrugged. One you ruined with a mop. O'Rourke's men are clumsy, but I am not." He raised the weapon, pointing it directly at Leo's sleeping form. Maya did not scream. She did not beg. Years of working in the chaotic, blood-soaked environment of an inner-city trauma center had taught her that panic was the enemy of survival. Her eyes darted to the heavy metal defibrillator cart, positioned directly to her right. "I am sorry, Maya," Luca said softly. "You really were quite brave." As Luca's finger tightened on the trigger, Maya violently kicked the release lever on the wheels of the heavy medical cart. With a primal yell, she shoved the 200-pound steel cart directly at Luca. The cart slammed into his waist, just as the gun coughed a suppressed thwip. The bullet shattered the glass of the IV fluid bag hanging above Leo's bed, raining saline down onto the blankets. Luca stumbled backward, cursing, trying to regain his footing and clear his line of sight. Maya didn't give him a second. She grabbed a heavy, solid steel oxygen regulator from the counter and hurled it with all her might at his head. The heavy metal glanced off Luca's shoulder, sending a shock-wave of pain down his gun arm. "Dr. Bennett!" Maya screamed at the top of her lungs, grabbing the edge of Leo's stretcher and frantically pushing it towards the reinforced doors of the supply closet. Luca recovered, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. He raised the gun again, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He aimed squarely at Maya's back as she shoved the stretcher into the closet. "Enough," Luca snarled. Suddenly the biometric lock on the main suite door flashed a violent emergency red. A klaxon alarm blared. Before Luca could pull the trigger, the reinforced steel door exploded inward. A shaped breaching charge ripped the heavy door entirely off its hinges, sending the massive slab of steel crashing into the center of the trauma bay in a cloud of pulverized concrete and smoke. Through the thick gray dust stepped Damien Costa. He was no longer the composed, tailored businessman. He was a force of absolute, untethered destruction. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt stained with fresh blood, not his own. In his hands, he held an assault rifle, the barrel still smoking. Behind him, Elias and Declan poured into the room, their weapons sweeping the corners. Luca spun around, leveling his pistol at the doorway, but Damien moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. Damien fired a single calculated shot. The bullet struck Luca in the right kneecap, shattering the bone instantly. Luca screamed, collapsing onto the tiled floor, his weapon skittering away under the ruined medical cart. He clutched his ruined leg, thrashing in a puddle of spilled saline and dust. Damien walked slowly into the room, his eyes scanning the chaos until they landed on the supply closet. Maya was standing there, her body shielding the stretcher, her hands gripping a surgical scalpel with white-knuckled intensity. She was panting, her scrubs covered in dust, but she was unharmed. And Leo was still asleep, his heart monitor beeping a steady, uninterrupted rhythm. Damien's chest heaved. He lowered the rifle, the murderous tension draining from his shoulders as he met Maya's eyes. "Are you hurt?" Damien asked, his voice barely a whisper through the ringing in his ears. Maya shook her head, dropping the scalpel. It clattered against the floor. He told me everything. He set you up." "I know," Damien said coldly, turning his attention back to the writhing man on the floor. He handed his rifle to Elias and drew his Glock 19, walking over to stand above his former friend and underboss. "You didn't go to Victoria's," Luca gasped, spitting blood onto the white tiles, staring up at the man he had tried to betray. "I am not a fool, Luca," Damien said, his voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying register. "As soon as I left this bunker, I called Victoria's private, hard-lined landline. The one you didn't know about," she answered. She was safe, having tea in her living room. There were no Irish hitmen. There was no hostage situation, which meant only one person had the power to falsify those server logs and send me into an empty trap. "Sir," Damien crouched down, pressing the searing hot muzzle of his pistol directly against Luca's forehead. "O'Rourke's men were waiting at the brownstone, weren't they?" Damien continued, his eyes devoid of any mercy. "An ambush. Elias and Declan cleared the street from the rooftops before we even got close. We captured O'Rourke's lieutenant. He sang like a bird about your little arrangement. You sold my son's life for shipping routes." "Damien, please," Luca choked out, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "We were brothers. We built this—" "You tried to kill my son," Damien interrupted, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You lose the right to call me brother." A single suppressed gunshot echoed in the bunker. Damien stood up slowly, holstering his weapon without a second glance at the body on the floor. "Elias, clean this up. Declan, get Dr. Bennett out of the lab. Tell him we are moving Leo to the upstate safe house immediately. Secure the transport." "Yes, boss," the men replied in unison, moving with rapid efficiency to clear the trauma bay. Damien walked back to the supply closet. Maya was sitting on the edge of Leo's stretcher, her hands covering her face. The adrenaline had finally, completely vanished, leaving behind the crushing weight of the night's violence. Damien stepped into the closet and knelt beside her. He reached out, his large hands gently engulfing her trembling wrists, pulling them away from her face. "It's over," Damien said softly. "O'Rourke is finished. His syndicate will be dismantled by morning. The threat is gone." "I was a nurse," Maya whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, cutting clean tracks through the dust and dried blood on her cheeks. "I saved lives. Tonight, I swung a metal tank at a man's head. I pushed a cart into a gunman. I don't know who I am anymore." Damien shifted closer. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek, careful of the bandage he had applied earlier. "You are a mother who knows what it means to lose a child," Damien said, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. "You are a warrior who stepped into the dark to protect a boy who wasn't even yours. You didn't lose yourself tonight, Maya. You found your fire again." He looked down at Leo, who shifted slightly under the blankets, his breathing deep and normal. The poison was fully flushed. He was safe. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Damien said, looking back into Maya's brown eyes. "But I spend the rest of my life trying. If you want to go back to your quiet life, I will ensure you have enough money to never work another day. I will erase your record. I will give you the world." Maya looked at the ruthless, dangerous man kneeling before her, a man wrapped in darkness, who loved his son with a blinding, desperate light. She thought of her empty, cold apartment. She thought of the hollow grief she had lived in for 3 years. "I don't want a quiet life," Maya said softly, her fingers curling around Damien's hand. "I just want a safe one." Damien's grip tightened on her hand, a small, genuine smile breaking through the heavy shadows of his face. "Then you stay with us. Always." 3 years later, the name Costa no longer struck fear into the underground syndicates of New York. Damien had meticulously dismantled the last remnants of his family's illicit empire, trading absolute power for absolute peace. The sprawling Long Island estate was no longer guarded by men with assault rifles, but by standard security, filled instead with the sound of laughter. In the newly funded pediatric wing of Lenox Hill Hospital, prominently named the Lily Lawson Memorial Center, Maya Costa stood in a crisp white lab coat. Her medical license had been fully reinstated, a quiet miracle orchestrated by her husband's high-powered legal team. She watched proudly as 8-year-old Leo cut the ceremonial ribbon, completely healthy and thriving. Damien stood beside them, his arm wrapped securely around Maya's waist, looking at his wife and son with a reverence reserved only for the divine. The violence of their past was buried deep, replaced by a profound, hard-won redemption. A Mafia king had fallen, but a father and a family had been saved by the unwavering courage of a woman with a mop.